friends. I got all fancy for you because in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about that extra fancy famed Harlem Nightclub, the Cotton Club. I know that when I think of the Cotton Club, I envision it as this glamorous venue where the drinks flowed like a river, sharp-dressed guests talk through air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and gardenias, while hot jazz melts over the crowd. There was definitely a darker, more seemly side to this fantasy I have held so dear, and I'm going to tell you all about it. I'm going to start from the very beginning in 1920, when the first African-American heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Jack Johnson, rented the upper floor of a building on the corner of 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue in the heart of Harlem. And he opened up a supper club called the Club Deluxe. He opened this club right after getting out of prison for violating the Mann Act. The Mann Act forbade the transportation of a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. Translation: he married a white woman and got put in prison for a year to teach him a lesson. Spoiler alert, no lesson was learned. After the year is up, Jack gets out the pokey and sets up this club. It's nice, it's classy, and it's a black and tan club, which means that it was racially mixed. About 3 years into this venture, he decides to go into business with Owen Madden, who was a big-time British gangster and bootlegger. And that's when things began to take a turn. The two arranged a deal that allowed Johnson to remain the club's manager, aka figurehead, with Madden obtaining ownership and creative control. He's got a whole nother plan for the club. He wanted to use it to bring the thriving and lucrative Harlem music scene to a whites-only audience. He would also use the club to sell Madden's #1 booze, his brand of banned liquor, which was a luxury to a population trapped in the clutches of prohibition, specifically white upper-class New Yorkers. Once he took over, Owen began to rapidly rebrand the Club Deluxe. He increased its capacity from 400 to 700 and installed completely new decor built around the southern plantations and exotic jungles, which supposedly reflected the origins of the black folks of Harlem. Even their menus echoed the theme, with imagery showing naked black men and women dancing around a drum in the jungle. Tribal mask illustrations made up the border of the menu. The staff were hired and dressed to reflect this inaccurate aesthetic, with dark-skinned waiters serving in comically red tuxedos and a young, light-skinned troupe of dancers in flashy, skimpy costumes that were expected to be tall, tan, and terrific, which meant that they had to be at least 5'6", light-skinned, and under 21 years of age. The male dancers, the Cotton Club boys, fared a bit better, as their skin colors were allowed to be more varied. None of the black performers were allowed to mix with the club's clientele, and after the show, many of them went next door to the basement of the superintendent at 646 Lenox Avenue, where they indulged in corn whiskey, peach brandy, and marijuana. Back to Owen. So he's finally got the club he's always envisioned, and his final bit of rebranding is to rename his venue the Cotton Club, after the light brown coloring of raw cotton. So now the Cotton Club is pretty terrible, especially since they stopped being a black and tan club, although they did let a few non-musicians that were black in, like Langston Hughes, who was a lot of things, among them a novelist, playwright, and columnist, and he wrote of the club in his autobiography, The Big C. Hughes criticized the club's segregated atmosphere and said that it was a Jim Crow club for gangsters and moneyed whites. In addition to the jungle music and plantation-themed interior, he also believed that Madden's idea of authentic black entertainment was similar to the entertainment provided at a zoo, and that white folks were given the best ringside tables to sit and stare at the Negro customers like amusing animals in a zoo. Hughes also believed that the Cotton Club negatively affected the Harlem community, with white patrons crowding out the little cabarets and bars where formerly only black folks laughed and sang. He also mentioned how many of the neighboring cabarets, especially black cabarets, were forced to close due to the competition from the Cotton Club. These smaller clubs did not have a large dance floor or music by famous entertainers and were unable to compete. Hughes was not the only one that found the club distasteful. Black Harlemites were affronted that only white patrons were allowed to infiltrate their neighborhood to celebrate the music by black people that they themselves were unable to participate in. Unfortunately, a lot of clubs in Harlem, like Connie's Inn and Small's Paradise, adopted the same segregation policies as the Cotton Club. There were even big old scary bouncers stationed at the entrance to make sure no black people were admitted in a black neighborhood. To add insult to injury, their shows and decor promoted a completely inaccurate imitation of black life, similar to those in minstrel shows. Back to the Cotton Club. It closed briefly in 1925 for selling liquor, because prohibition, but it soon reopened without interference from the police, and it was business as usual. This was one of the perks of the club being owned by a gangster who had the police in his pocket. Now, let's go back to the performers that worked at the club. The club featured regular celebrity nights on Sundays with guests such as Jimmy Durante, George Gershwin, Sophie Tucker, Al Jolson, Judy Garland, and Mae West. But the regular performers were primarily black musicians. In fact, Duke Ellington and his orchestra were the house band from 1927 to 1931, and again in 1933. Between 1931 and 1933, Cab Calloway took over as band leader. Of course, while Ellington was in residence at the club, he was expected to conform to the theme and write jungle music to feed into the fantasy of a white audience, and also had to ask permission for his own friends to see his show. That said, he was wildly successful at the club with his musical reviews. To give you a bit of background, shows at the Cotton Club were musical reviews, and several were called Cotton Club Paradise, followed by the year. The reviews were created twice a year in hopes of becoming successful Broadway shows. They featured dancers, singers, comedians, and variety acts, as well as a house band. These reviews helped launch the careers of many artists, including Ellington. The first review that he and his orchestra performed was called Rhythmania and featured Adelaide Hall. Hall had just recorded several songs with Duke, including a song called Creole Love Call that became a worldwide hit and gave his review extra local exposure. The club gave him additional national exposure through radio broadcasts that were held there live. His tenure there helped him to develop his repertoire and gave him the freedom to experiment with orchestral arrangements that touring bands rarely experienced. He recorded more than 100 compositions during this time. Ellington didn't simply accept his success, though. He lobbied for and eventually got Owen to slightly relax the club's policy of segregation and let an occasional famous black person in. In 1930, Cab Calloway and his orchestra brought its Brown Sugar review to the club and eventually replaced Ellington's orchestra after its departure in 1931. When Cab took over, his Minnie the Moocher routine was so famous and such a big moneymaker that the Plantation Club, another Cotton Club imitation, tried to hire him and his orchestra away. Gangster Madden was, of course, not pleased, so he sent a few of his men over to smash up the place. They destroyed tables and chairs, shattered glasses, and they even dragged the actual bar out onto the curb. Obviously, Cab returned to the Cotton Club. One of the most famous Cotton Club parade reviews came while Cab was the house band for the club in 1933. and it featured Ethel Waters and Duke Ellington performing Stormy Weather. Later, this performance would also include Lena Horne and Katherine Dunham in the film adaptation of Stormy Weather. When Cab left, Jimmy Lunsford's band replaced him in 1934, and during his tenure, Ellington, Calloway, and Louis Armstrong returned to perform at the club. Lena Horne, she also began her career at the club, I believe at the age of 16, and she sang Sweeter Than Sweet with Calloway. Dorothy Dandridge performed at the club while part of the Dandridge Sisters, and Coleman Hawkins and Don Redman played at the club as part of Henderson's band. Tap dancers Bill Bojangles Robinson, Sammy Davis Jr. as part of the Will Maston Trio, and the Nicholas Brothers performed at the club as well. Also, in 1934, Adelaide starred in the Cotton Club Parade of 1934, and it became the highest-grossing show ever to appear at the club. The show opened on March 11th and ran for 6 months, attracting over 600,000 paying customers. After appearing at the club, the entire show, starring Adelaide, was taken out on a road tour across America. In June of 1935, the Cotton Club opened its doors to Black patrons. They did this in preparation for a Joe Louis fight, and they planned a huge gala and extended an open invitation to the Sepians. The Sepians, okay. The club closed temporarily in 1936 after a race riot in Harlem the previous year, but reopened later that year at Broadway and 48th. Herman Stark, general manager and part owner of the Cotton Club, and the club's other investors were pretty sure the club would succeed in this new location, but they did realize that they'd need a very successful opening show. Hence, the most extravagant revue in the club's 13-year history opened on September 24th, 1936, with Bill Bojangles Robinson and Cab Calloway leading a roster of 130 performers. Stark paid Bill $3,500 a week, the highest salary ever paid to a Black entertainer in a Broadway production, and the highest salary that had ever been paid to any nightclub entertainer. Despite all the fanfare and expense, the Cotton Club closed permanently in 1940 under pressure from higher rents, changing taste, thank God, and a federal investigation into tax evasion by the nightclub owners. The Latin Quarter nightclub opened in its space, and the building was torn down in 1989 to build a hotel. And there you have it, folks, the whole story about the Cotton Club. Yes, it helped launch the careers or showcase the talent of some of the most famous jazz or blues musicians in the world, including Billie Holiday, Chick Webb, and Bessie Smith, but it wasn't that great for them or the Black people whose neighborhood it resided in. While the history of the club ain't all wine and roses, I'm thankful for any venue that allowed my favorite Black superstars to show off their talents. And that's it, my dears. This was a bit longer than normal, but I found the topic so interesting that I didn't want to break it up into 2 episodes, especially since my next episode is going to be all about Ella Fitzgerald, and I can't wait to share all of the information I found out about her with you. As always, if you liked what you saw, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you the Friday after next for a little chitty chat about Ella.